When I walked into that courtroom, Richard's smirk told me he thought he'd already buried me. Elaine didn't even bother to hide her contempt. To them, I wasn't a sister. I was a problem to erase, a burden they could finally strip away. But when the judge looked up and saw me, his face froze. The words he whispered, "It's her," shattered the silence. In that instant, everyone realized there was a truth about me they had never imagined. The air inside the county courthouse pressed down like a weight, thick with whispers and unspoken judgment. Every step I took along the aisle sent a ripple through the gallery. People leaned in, their voices low but sharp, the kind of murmurs meant to wound without leaving a visible scar. I caught fragments. Unstable. Can't manage. Broken. As though I wasn't standing right there, hearing each poisoned syllable. Richard sat at the plaintiff's table, his suit crisp, his tie knotted too tight, but his grin loose and smug, stretched across his face like he'd already claimed victory. Elaine perched beside him, polished to perfection, her chin slightly raised, eyes sliding over me with cool disdain. She leaned in close to him, and the two of them shared a laugh, subtle but pointed. Their confidence reeked of entitlement, the kind that grows when someone believes the world owes them everything. Across the aisle, their lawyer shuffled papers with deliberate calm, clearly rehearsed for the show he thought this would be. The rows behind him were crowded with neighbors who had once waved from porches and shared Sunday meals, but now eyed me as though I were a stranger. Some held their phones half hidden, ready to capture a fall they had already scripted in their minds. The bailiff's voice cut through the buzz. "All rise." A hush swept over the room as the heavy door opened. Judge Marcus Ellison stepped in, robe falling neatly to his shoes, posture steady with authority. His expression was neutral, until his eyes landed on me. For a heartbeat. He froze. His hand, mid-motion, stilled on the bench. The shift in his face was subtle but undeniable, a recognition that reached deeper than the surface. His lips parted, a few words slipping out low, meant for no one, and yet heard by all. The silence that followed was electric, a current that tightened every throat in the room. That look, that single moment, carried a secret none of them could have anticipated, something buried in a past only he and I remembered. The memory of our father's voice still clung to the walls of that old farmhouse. He trusted me with the land because I respected its weight, the rhythm of the horses, the discipline it demanded, the history etched into every fence post. Richard never cared for any of that. He wanted profit, quick returns, shortcuts that would never last. Even as kids, he chased what shone the brightest while I learned to bear the grind. When our father passed, grief should have bound us. Instead, it split us open. Richard wasted no time circling the estate like a vulture, insisting I couldn't possibly handle it alone. He called me stubborn, broken by years away, and told anyone who would listen that the ranch would collapse under my hands. His words stung not for their truth, but for the way people nodded as if they believed him. Then I stumbled across something worse than his insults, proof of betrayal, hidden among legal files left carelessly on his desk. I found a signed agreement. Richard had already struck a deal with a real estate developer to carve up part of our father's land. The ink on that contract was bold and final, but his authority to sell meant nothing without the court's approval. He knew it. He did it anyway. The realization burned through me like fire. This wasn't just about his greed or his contempt. Richard was willing to gut the very heart of what our father built before the law had even spoken. And if he had gone this far in secret, I could only imagine how deep the rot ran. The stable smelled of hay and old wood, the same scent that had clung to my father's boots every night he came in from the fields. I was sweeping when my broom struck something uneven beneath the planks. I pried the board loose and found a small wooden box tucked in the dark, as though my father had left it there waiting for me. Inside was his handwriting, shaky but firm, the kind I knew by heart. "You are the one meant to guard this ranch. Don't let greed destroy what I've left behind." The words blurred as I read them, my chest tightening with both pride and grief. He had known Richard's weakness long before it came to this, and he had trusted me to hold the line. Beneath the letter was a photograph, edges worn but image still clear. Me, drenched and exhausted, pulling a young officer out of floodwaters in New Orleans. I remembered the roar of the storm, the weight of his body, the certainty that neither of us would survive unless I refused to let go. And now, staring back at me in that faded photo, was the unmistakable face of Judge Marcus Ellison. A cold rush went through me. The man sitting in judgment of my family's future was the same man whose life I had once pulled from disaster. That secret, buried all these years, wasn't just a memory. It was a card that could change everything in this courtroom war. Richard struck the first blow with the arrogance of a man certain of victory. His lawyer rose smoothly and submitted a report that painted me as unfit, a liability too damaged to manage a single acre. The words post-traumatic stress disorder rang out, deliberate and heavy, as if meant to shame me into silence. Then came their so-called expert, a psychiatrist who spoke as though he had studied my every breath. He never met me, but his voice dripped with authority as he described me as a ticking time bomb, someone who could not be trusted with responsibility. I didn't flinch. I let him talk, watching his lips move, waiting for the tell. When the report landed in front of me, my eyes immediately found it, the formatting wrong. The letterhead not in line with the standards of any VA hospital I had ever dealt with. A sloppy forgery, obvious to anyone who had lived inside courtrooms as long as I had. It almost made me laugh. But outside the evidence, the damage worked its way in. I could hear the murmurs ripple through the gallery. Neighbors who once cheered for me at parades leaned toward each other and whispered. Their expressions carried doubt, even pity. I caught the words alone and unstable hissed just loud enough to sting. In their eyes, I wasn't just fighting Richard. I was fighting a story they wanted to believe. I kept my mouth shut. A single outburst would prove them right. Timing was everything. I knew the only way to win was to let them tighten their own noose. And when the moment came, pull hard. By morning, the whispers turned into headlines. The local paper splashed it across the front page. Unstable veteran threatens community safety. At the grocery store, I felt eyes on me as I walked the aisles. A woman's voice, sharp and cutting, carried from behind me. That's her. They say she's dangerous. It wasn't the words that cut deepest. It was the betrayal when an old neighbor I once considered family pressed a framed photo into my hands. The one where both our families stood smiling under the oak tree years ago. He shook his head, muttered something about not wanting to be dragged into scandal, and walked away. That rejection was colder than any courtroom. I went home that night, ready for the silence. But I wasn't alone. On my porch stood James Carter, a face from the past, steady as ever. "We never fought alone," he said simply. His presence cracked the shell I'd been holding tight. We sat at the table long into the night, combing through Richard's paperwork. James's eyes sharpened when he found what I had missed. "Here," he said, tapping a page. He used the land to secure loans, gambling debts. Federal law won't look kindly on this. The realization hit hard. Richard wasn't just trying to cheat me out of my inheritance. He was digging himself into a grave of fraud and criminal exposure. The fight had shifted. This was no longer just a family feud. It was the beginning of a war that could put Richard behind bars. Richard doubled down, dragging in another attorney and parading neighbors as so-called witnesses. One woman swore she'd heard me screaming in the middle of the night. Another claimed I had frightened her children. They painted me as someone who had lost all control, unfit to live alone, let alone manage acres of land. The smugness on Richard's face said he thought he'd nailed me to the wall, but the cracks showed quickly. My lawyer rose, voice calm but cutting, and asked the witnesses simple questions. How much had they been paid, and by whom? The hesitation, the shifting eyes, the stammering answers spoke louder than any denial. When the truth surfaced, that Richard had offered them money for their testimony, The entire courtroom shifted. What had started as whispers of doubt turned into murmurs of disbelief directed at him. I seized the moment and laid out my evidence. The supposed contract to sell part of the land, the one Richard had waved around so proudly. I set it side by side with our father's genuine handwriting. The difference was glaring, the forgery almost insulting in its sloppiness. Richard sneered, called me a liar, but his laugh rang hollow. Then James Carter stepped forward with something heavier. He presented bank records that showed Richard had already used the land as collateral to cover his gambling debts. Unauthorized, illegal, reckless. The courtroom erupted in noise, and for the first time, Richard's mask cracked. He snapped at his own lawyer, voice sharp, face flushed, watching him unravel. I knew the battle lines were finally shifting. The next morning, the headlines multiplied. Reporters camped outside my gates, cameras flashing as I carried buckets of feed to the horses. They didn't see me caring for what my father built. They saw a spectacle. The crazy horsewoman, one column sneered, paired with an unflattering photograph of me in work clothes, hair tied back, mud on my boots. Each article was another blade, meant to cut whatever dignity I had left. That evening, as the sky dimmed and the stable lights glowed faintly, I heard a knock. Elaine stood on the porch, pale and trembling, her eyes rimmed red from lack of sleep. She looked nothing like the composed partner who had laughed at Richard's side in court. "Helena," she whispered, voice breaking. "He's going too far. I'm scared. For him. For me. For all of us." For a moment, I saw the fracture in her loyalty, the space where doubt had finally wedged its way in. If she chose to speak the truth, she could dismantle everything Richard had built against me. But fear weighed heavier than courage. Before leaving, she gripped the railing, her words barely audible. "He won't stop. You'd better be ready." Then she slipped into the night, her warning lingering in the still air. I stood on the porch long after she'd gone, the sound of hooves echoing from the pasture, steady and haunting. The fight wasn't over, it was only tightening. And as the darkness closed in around the ranch, I knew the next move Richard made could be the most dangerous yet. The air inside the courtroom was charged, thick with anticipation as Richard unveiled his final weapon. His lawyer called their expert witness, a doctor I had never seen before, a man with neatly pressed sleeves and rehearsed gravitas. He read from a stack of papers, his voice steady and theatrical, painting me as dangerous, volatile, incapable of rational thought. He called me unstable, a liability to myself and others, a threat hiding in plain sight. Whispers rippled through the gallery. I caught the sharp hiss of neighbors leaning into each other, some shaking their heads, others scribbling notes as though the verdict had already been sealed. The press fed on the tension, cameras snapping with each word, hungry to capture the image of a woman unraveling under scrutiny. But I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I sat in silence, hands folded, my eyes fixed ahead. Every instinct told me to fight, to speak, to defend myself, but I knew better. Let them believe they were winning. Let them climb higher on the scaffolding of lies. The fall would hurt more that way. Then my lawyer stood, calm, deliberate. His voice cut through the room like a blade. He walked to the projector, lifted a photograph, and placed it for all to see. The screen glowed with an image from years ago. Me waist-deep in floodwater, drenched, gripping the arm of a young officer as I dragged him from the chaos of Katrina. The room stilled. A beat of silence. Then the scrape of a chair. Judge Marcus Ellison stared at the photograph, his expression shifting, recognition flooding his features. Slowly, he removed his glasses, voice low but clear. "If it weren't for her, I wouldn't be alive today. I know her character." The gallery gasped, then fell into a silence so deep it felt suffocating. Every accusation Richard had hurled against me shattered in an instant. His fortress of lies collapsed, and for the first time since this battle began, the truth stood taller than his deceit. The courtroom still trembled from the weight of the judge's words when my lawyer rose again. His calmness was deliberate, the kind of composure that only made Richard's agitation more obvious. He carried a stack of documents to the bench and began laying them out piece by piece. The first was the so-called sales agreement Richard had waved around like a trophy. The next were the bank records James Carter had uncovered, showing the land already mortgaged to cover gambling debts. Side by side, they told a story of fraud so blatant it was almost insulting. "This isn't inheritance planning," my lawyer said, his voice sharp enough to cut through the stale air. "This is forgery, theft, and deception of the court." The murmurs from the gallery grew louder, but it was Elaine who broke the tension. She rose slowly, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. Her face was pale, but her words were steady enough to pierce every ear in the room. "He forced me to sign. I was scared." The gallery gasped. For a moment, the air hung still, as though no one dared move. Richard's head snapped toward her, his eyes wide with disbelief and fury. He spat her name, demanded she sit down, but she didn't. Her confession shifted the balance entirely. Elaine had crossed the line from silent accomplice to witness, leaving him exposed and utterly alone. Richard's composure shattered. He lurched up from his chair, his voice cracking with rage. "This is a setup. You're all in on it." His fist slammed the table, papers scattering to the floor as his accusations spilled in every direction. The bailiff moved in, but Richard shoved his chair back so hard it scraped across the tiles like a scream. The judge's gavel came down hard. "Enough!" His voice was cold steel. "The evidence speaks for itself. This court will not tolerate contempt or violence. All records of fraud and forgery will be referred immediately to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation." The bailiffs closed in, gripping Richard by the arms as he struggled, his shouts echoing uselessly against the wooden walls. His tie hung loose, his jacket twisted, his face blotched red with humiliation. He fought, but it was hollow resistance, the kind of thrashing that only deepened the spectacle of defeat. Elaine stood frozen, tears welling but unshed, her shoulders caving as if the truth had cost her every ounce of strength she had left. Around us, the gallery buzzed with shock and whispers, a storm of disbelief and satisfaction. And then it was over. The last image of Richard was not the polished man who had strutted into this courtroom, but a broken figure dragged through the doors by lawmen, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only disgrace in its place. The judgment was final, and for the first time in months, the weight pressing on my shoulders lifted. The land, the barns, every acre my father had built with discipline and devotion was mine to protect. Yet as I walked the pastures in the days that followed, I knew keeping it for myself was never the point. What mattered was giving it new life. I opened the gates of the ranch not as a private estate, but as the Fairbanks Veterans Retreat, a place where men and women carrying invisible scars could find strength again through the quiet power of horses. On opening day, the pastures were alive with the sound of hooves and the murmur of voices. Dozens of veterans ran their hands along the warm flanks of the horses, their faces softening, shoulders easing as though the animals had lifted burdens no one else could touch. Watching them, I felt something shift inside me. The pain of the fight was still there, but it was no longer the center of me. At the edge of the crowd, Judge Ellison stood quietly, hands folded, his eyes steady on mine. He didn't speak, didn't need to. A simple nod carried more weight than any speech could. It was acknowledgement, respect, and a reminder of the bond neither of us would ever forget. A week later, Elaine appeared at the porch, her steps hesitant, a small box clutched in her hands. Her eyes brimmed with tears as she pressed it into mine. Inside were my father's old keepsakes, his pocket knife, a faded medal, letters worn with time. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. That night, I stood on the porch as the retreat glowed golden behind me, the laughter of veterans drifting through the air. I looked out into the dark fields and whispered to my father, "Your legacy is safe, Not just for me, but for all who need it. Revenge had steadied me when everything else was slipping. But it was justice, and the chance to rebuild, that became the true victory. Aim 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 the true victory.